Hi everyone, my name's Sam and this is my colleague and good friend Marcus, and we're both lawyers from MS Legal Centre just down the road there. Now first of all, I'd just like to say thank you all for coming out to the park to listen to what we have to say. As a mothers group, Marcus and I can't begin to imagine how busy all your lives are, but by speaking down the park, we thought you could bring your kids along to play or just enjoy the sun as it's such a beautiful day. Now, as I hope most of you are aware, we're here to talk about a very serious, prevalent and dangerous issue that kills on average 1 woman a week in Australia: domestic violence. Before proceeding any further, I would just like to mention that due to the disturbing nature of this area of law, some of the content in this presentation can be quite upsetting to some. Please feel free to stop us or simply leave now or at any time if you feel you may have some sort of traumatic reaction to the things discussed. Marcus and I have given this presentation, Strategies to Escape Domestic Violence, a great number of times all over Queensland. We often find that some audience members have a tendency to switch off after we announce the title of the presentation, as they themselves are in a happy, stable relationship and therefore are not currently suffering at the hands of a loved one. If you are part of that group of people, I would just urge you to listen on. Domestic violence does not discriminate based on how long you've been in a happy relationship. We often deal with people who have had a happy relationship for years and all of a sudden it turns sour. Essentially, domestic violence can strike at any time and in any relationship. Even further still, although you may not personally be subjected to domestic violence in your lifetime, unfortunately, statistically, someone you know will suffer at the hands of a loved one. And this information that we provide today could become very useful in helping a good friend or family member escape their toxic relationship. This presentation centers around practical steps that can be taken by someone who is suffering from domestic violence. Marcus and I could stand here discussing complex legal jargon or even just rattle off statistics all morning, but we really don't think those things can help anyone as much as practical, real, definitive steps that we can utilize should we find ourselves in an abusive relationship. Following that, we'll touch on a legal tool that is commonly utilized by domestic violence sufferers, known as a domestic violence order, or more commonly, a DVO. Before all that, I'm going to do what I find a lot of information in this area brushes over, and that's very simply defining domestic violence. From my perspective, I feel society as a whole has a tendency to picture domestic violence as simply a male physically abusing his female partner. Whilst yes, this sort of domestic violence is common, it's not the only type. So often when people see or experience different kinds of domestic violence, such as emotional abuse or a wife abusing a husband, it gets brushed off as something other than what it really is, which is domestic violence. That being said, before we go any further, it should be noted that although often men suffer abuse at the hands of their wife, for the purposes of this presentation, seeing as we're talking to a mothers group, we're going to be solely talking about violence against women. Now, in 1993, a declaration on the elimination of violence against women was adopted by the UN General Assembly. Article 1 of this declaration gives us some definitions. Namely, that violence against women means any act or gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women. Further, it includes threats such as acts, coercion, or deprivation of liberty. Article 2 goes a bit further and gives us some examples. Battery, sexual abuse of female children in the household, dowry-related violence, which is basically violence surrounding gifts or payments that traditionally come with marriage. We've got marital rape, female genital mutilation, as well as some other traditional practices that are harmful to women, non-spousal violence, and violence-related exploitation. Now, although some of these things are really tough to hear, the key thing I want everyone here to take away is that from these definitions is that domestic violence and abuse against women expands far beyond physical abuse. It can also be emotional abuse, verbal abuse, social abuse, economic abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, and sexual abuse. Now that we have more of an understanding of what domestic violence really is, Marcus is going to discuss those tangible, practical steps I mentioned earlier. For anyone who ever finds themselves in this situation where these things have occurred or are trying to help someone who is suffering.
Thanks, Sam. As Sam has said, domestic violence is such a serious issue and takes so many forms. If you believe that you are experiencing domestic violence, then you may think that you have no options. If you have no access to financial support and you have lost contact with your family or close friends, you may think you are trapped. This is the nature of domestic violence, having the victim seemingly isolated and trapped with their perpetrator. This belief is not weakness. This belief is the victim intuitively sensing the danger they are in. The following steps are quoted from the New South Wales Community and Justice webpage titled How to Leave a Violent Relationship Safely. Build a support network. In other words, make friends with work colleagues and any other social clubs that you are associated with. Speak to domestic violence service support workers. These numbers will be compiled and given to you in an information sheet at the end of the presentation. Have a safety plan. When I attended Griffith Uni and studied family law, our lecturer described this as having a go bag ready. This go bag would contain cash, clothes, legal documents, etc. Practice web and tech safety. Maybe purchase an alternative prepaid phone, as your abuser may be tracking your phone calls. Learn how to delete internet history and phone calls from your phone. Getting legal advice. If you and the perpetrator have had children or if you own property together, then getting legal advice is essential. Firstly, where do I get legal advice? Free legal advice for DV victims can be sought from the Women's Legal Service, with appointments that can be made over the phone Monday to Friday, 9am to 5pm. Walk-in appointments are taken until 6pm on Monday and Wednesday at the NLE office. The address and phone numbers will be handed out at the end of the presentation. If you are below a certain financial threshold with limited means, you also may make an application for legal aid. Why legal aid is necessary, or why legal advice is necessary. There can be misconceptions that when a victim leaves, the perpetrator will be able to keep all the property and keep any children of the relationship. This is not correct. Firstly, under the Family Law Act, the family court's primary consideration is to protect the children from physical or psychological harm from being subjected to or exposed to abuse, neglect, or family violence. The courts will make orders in what they believe to be in the best interests of the child, and this may include supervised visits in a contact centre or no contact with the perpetrator at all. This is of course if they make the finding that there has been family violence occurring. As for property, the domestic violence victim may own with their partners, the court can make a declaration as to how the property or properties should be divided between each person of the former relationship under the Family Law Act. This is why getting legal advice is so important. The lawyer will be able to advise if steps need to be taken to freeze real estate being transferred or sold, freeze bank accounts so that you'll be able to receive your equal share from the combined proceeds of the relationship. Further, there has been some case law in making financial adjustments for victims of extreme domestic violence, called the Kennan Adjustment, or Kennan Principle. This generally means that if domestic violence in the relationship has made it impossible for the victim to gain employment or to stay employed, the court will acknowledge this. In other words, if extreme domestic violence has kept the victim from earning money, then the court may order the victim a greater share of the relationship's combined assets. Lastly, the Family Law Act also can make findings in terms of property for domestic violence victims that are not married or with children, but are in de facto relationships. The court will examine if two individuals have a relationship as a couple living together on a genuine domestic basis. There is a full checklist for how the court would determine if you are in a de facto relationship. As mentioned by Sam at the start of the presentation, and throughout my discussion surrounding legal advice, the court makes orders. A court order is an enforceable legal direction for an action to be done or to restrain an action from being done. For example, the court may make an order of who in the relationship gets to remain in the house, or that the house should be sold. Sam will now discuss court orders in relation to domestic violence, known as DVOs.
Thanks, Marcus. So, as Marcus said, after seeking legal advice, it's pretty likely that your solicitor will apply for a domestic violence order or DVO. As the Queensland Court's website indicates, a DVO is an official document issued by the court to stop threats or acts of violence. It basically sets out rules that the violent person or respondent, as they are known, must legally obey. The rules are written in a way that is intended to keep the victim safe and are illegal to violate. Orders typically have conditions that make it illegal for the perpetrator to approach the victim's home or work, stay at the home that they both currently share or have previously shared, even if it's rented or owned in their name, going to the child's school or daycare, or approaching family and friends if they're named on the order. So there are two types of domestic violence orders. Most common ones are protection orders, which are made by a magistrate in a courtroom and last a substantial amount of time. But if you ever find yourself in urgent need of a protection order, the other type of DVO is a temporary protection order. This is basically just the exact same thing as a protection order, but it is for a shorter time to protect those in danger up until the date the magistrate can decide the application for a full protection order. After speaking with a lawyer, they will be able to help you determine whether a temporary protection order is necessary before the final protection order decision. So when the magistrate decides whether to issue a protection order, they base their decision on three things. A, whether a relationship exists between the perpetrator and the victim. B, whether domestic violence has actually occurred. And C, whether a DVO is necessary or desirable to protect the victim. Obviously, if domestic violence has occurred, although a DVA application is an understandable legal starting point, occasionally it won't pass due to the third part of the test I just mentioned, whether it's necessary or desirable. The first two parts are the easier ones, as they are not discretionary in nature, they're more factual. But for example, if circumstances have changed, like if you've moved away from the perpetrator, or even if the abuse has occurred some time ago, it's easy to imagine why the magistrate might decide that it wouldn't really be necessary to have a DVO, as violent behaviour wouldn't be likely to happen again. Now, it's important to note that if a DVO is not issued, it's not the end of the world. Often if this occurs, victims can feel hopeless or almost as if they have failed. This is not the case. Once a perpetrator knows you have attempted to take illegal action, they're going to be far more reluctant to display violent behaviour. They essentially know you mean business. Further, if they were then to attempt any abuse, they will essentially exhibit behaviour that satisfies the discretionary test and will prove that a DVO is necessary, and that will therefore make it very easy for a magistrate to accept the application. It's important to note that a DVO, whilst creating a weighty argument in determining time that each parent spends with the children, won't negate the DVO respondent's parental responsibility. The court has the overall view that the child should benefit from a meaning relationship with both parents. But as Marcus said, the court's main overarching motivation is to keep the children safe. Anyway, that was a very simple explanation of quite a complex area of law. So if you have any more questions or there's something that you don't really understand, please feel free to come and have a chat to us after the presentation or come and see us down at the Legal Centre. I'll pass you back to Marcus just to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Well, that concludes our presentation. On behalf of Sam, myself, and MS Legal Centre, we want to thank you all so much for coming out and hearing us out. We really hope you learned something, and if you one day find yourself in a domestic violence situation or assisting someone in a violent relationship, we hope that you remember some of the strategies we talked about. If you have any questions about the presentation, we are going to grab a coffee and hang around to chat. Thanks again, and be safe.